Hello everyone, Stanley Yates here. I'm very happy to be part of this online GFA event, and I certainly hope you're all safe and well. I'm going to be continuing on from Jonathan's discussion, but talking about early 19th century music. There are three things that I would like to touch on. The first is this idea of using improvisation as a tool for teaching composed music, understanding composed music. The second thing, I need something to kind of demonstrate with this, so I want to take a quick look at our textbook kind of harmonic theory that we learn in school and see how this compares with historical harmonic practice in the early 19th century. And then we'll look at some patterns, some schemata and formulas and a process for developing the ability to improvise in a kind of prelude style using this historical harmonic system. So, improvisation as a pedagogical tool. Just to clarify, we're not talking about teaching improvisation. We're talking about using improvisation as a tool to further internalize our understanding of written music. This sounds a little counterintuitive, at least it did to me when Jonathan sent me an article a couple of years ago called Improvisation as a Way of Knowing. This was written by Andrew Goldman, and it's a meta-study that surveys a good range of published research by psychologists and brain function people. It turns out that these people are quite interested in performing musicians and improvising musicians because they consider this to be a high domain activity that engages many parts of the brain when we're doing it. Something that comes out of these studies, is of particular interest to us, is that musicians who improvise regularly seem to have some side benefits of this that non-improvising musicians don't have to the same extent. So the improvisers tend to internalize music more deeply and in more detail. They tend to have enhanced sensitivity to things such as pitch accuracy, rhythmic acuity, timbre, expressive nuance. They have an enhanced ability to audiate, to mentally hear music and its nuance. This is particularly interesting for us as performers and teachers of composed music because our job essentially is to bring a good deal of compelling expressive nuance to our performances. And of course, if we can't audiate that nuance, it's not very likely that we'll be able to actually physically produce it. And improvisers who read music tend to be better sight readers. I think this relates to their ability to audiate well, to look at a piece of music and hear it. And this idea of perception-action coupling, which the idea that when a musician audiates music, almost simultaneously, the neurological process for bringing that into a physical reality takes place as well. On a more practical level, improvisation we can think of as something that we can use in addition to the tools we already have to bridge the gap between theoretical ideas and musical performance. Our normal process in teaching and understanding music is to have some kind of theoretical ideas, label a piece of music according to those ideas, and then do something else, probably play the piece. Maybe notice that there's a diminished seventh we've written there, and this might lead us to try and do something with that. But the something else can also be improvisation. So essentially, we're proposing that improvisation is a further way of understanding and internalizing music. So moving on to this harmony business. Our textbook harmonic theory that we're trained with in school is based on the late 19th century ideas of Hugo Riemann. We all know what it is. Roman numerals, ideas of dominant tonic function, maybe adding some superscript numerals to indicate inversion, the idea that a chord in all of its inversions is essentially the same chord even though an inverted chord sounds and feels very different to one in root position. It's also meant to be a theory that we can use to explain almost the harmonic usage of the entire tonal music repertoire from the Renaissance to the end of the Romantic period. Let's take a look at classical early Romantic period harmony. There are essentially two styles that were being used in the same piece, to varying degrees. The first style we can term low style galant harmony. This is the kind of Jean-Jacques Rousseau idea that melody is the important thing, harmony should be simple and obtrusive, and it consists of a small set of chords, usually in root position, that will harmonize a song or an aria or another piece. And of course, this fits our textbook system of discrete chords and chord progressions quite well. The second style is this high style contrapuntally derived harmony built above a bass. Now you're probably thinking this sounds suspiciously like Baroque harmonic practice, and it is. But the fact of the matter is that this was the system that all composers and musicians trained with from the early 18th century until well into the 19th century. And this style of harmony is not fully explained by our textbook harmonic system that we learn in school. I'd like to look briefly at the Partimento training system. This is a historical system that developed in the Italian conservatories in the early 18th century and continued to be used well into the 19th century. It spread throughout Europe. It was used in France, it was used in the Germanic-speaking countries, and it was essentially the way that all trained musicians were taught harmony well into the 19th century. Above all, it's a practical system, and it's based on usually short bass patterns, bass schemata or formulas. So what would happen is that a student would be given one of these bass patterns along with some guiding rules as to how to add harmonizing lines above it. And then they would explore this, and to kind of pass the test, they would have to demonstrate they could improvise a variety of solutions to that pattern. So let's take a look at one of these bass formulas, the rule of the octave that Jonathan has already mentioned. This is one of the fundamental Partimenti exercises, and it provides guidance for harmonizing an ascending or a descending bass line. There's a separate rule for each of those, and there's a separate rule depending on whether it's major or minor mode. Here's a major mode rule of the octave realization in 3 voices. And what we can see from this example is that there are 2 pillars of stable chords based on 1 and 5, not surprisingly. The remaining scale degrees are unstable chords, and they have to move to one of the pillars. So let's have a listen to this. I think what we can hear there is very smooth harmonic progression. We'll look at the same thing in 4 voices as well. We have greater availability of intervals because we can use 7th chords, but the basic principle remains that we have 2 stable pillars with the remaining scale degrees being unstable. Again, very smooth harmonic progression. So let's take a look at classical early Romantic period guitar music. We know that obviously it very often uses low style simple harmonic accompaniment of a small set of root position chords essentially. But we also have examples of strict learned counterpoint written by some of our better trained guitarist composers. We could mention Sohr's well-known imitative 3-part C major study chorale, Giuliani's Opus 114 Fuguetta, the 2 Diabelli fugues, I think it's Opus 46, and the many contrapuntal suspension chains that we find in the much underestimated composer Thomas Wenceslaus Maciejka. These were well-trained musicians and quite capable contrapuntists who could write strict counterpoint on the guitar. It tells us how they were trained. Now, did guitarists also employ high-style Partimento harmonic accompaniment to their pieces? Let's take a look at this. Here's an example taken from Carulli's Harmony Applied to the Guitar, which he published in Paris in 1825. It's a method book for teaching how to write accompaniments to songs and other melodies. So we have two examples. Each consists of a complete ascending and complete descending bass line, and one's in major, one's in minor. And in arpeggiated form, what Carulli does here is follow to the letter the rule of the octave. The root position chords are on 1 and 5, the rest are in inversion. And in his accompanying text, it's obvious that he's quite aware of that. So what we have here is Carulli in Paris in 1825 telling his readers to consider using the rule of the octave as something they can do to harmonize their songs. So let's have a look at some practical examples from the repertoire. First of all, here's a low-style harmonic accompaniment from a Giuliani song. And we can just look at the bass line and see it's a bunch of root position chords, just 1s and 5s in A minor, followed by a 5-1 in C. But then at the end, we have some stepwise movement in the bass for the cadential passage. And this is harmonized according to the rule of the octave. So let's just hear some of these sounds. I won't play the whole thing, but we've got these kinds of things. And then this very smooth rule of the octave harmonized cadential progression. Here's another example from Giuliani, from one of the studies. It was one of the simplest I could find. Of course, it's a melodic upper voice, etc. But if we reduce this down to the actual progression itself, we take a look at the bass and we can see we have an ascending or stepwise bass in C major, harmonized according to the rule, followed by some leaps in the bass for a cadence, and then another rule of the octave bass ascent, now in the dominant key. Let's just listen to this so we get it in our ears, something like this. So this is a perfect example of Partimento style harmony. So how might we internalize and teach this harmonic style? Well, the usual way of some theoretical guidance, but then we can take some further steps in real time on the instrument, exploring the theoretical guidance, experimenting with it, and eventually freely improvising on it. And the ideal genre to use for this would be the prelude. So I'm not speaking of the kind of improvised performance prelude that might preface a piece of music, but rather the figuration prelude. This is a genre that's defined usually by a single repeated figuration throughout, an arpeggio pattern perhaps, and the active element is harmony, so it's perfect for our purposes. We have some historical guitar examples that we can use as models, not very many, but we have some. Carulli Opus 114 is a good source, and also very often pieces called such things as lesson, exercise, etude, caprice, etc. Are indistinguishable from the figuration prelude. So we do have some models to turn to in our repertoire to get some stylistic guidance if we feel that we need that. But we need a plan to start preluding. So we'll start with some cadential schemata, and we'll take a leaf from Cole Czerny's detailed treatise on improvising preludes for the pianoforte, just from the first page, in which he says the shortest preludes consist of only 2 chords, 5, 7, and 1. There's the schemata. Doesn't look very interesting, but there's actually quite a lot we can do with it. And I guess this would be the King's Pawn opening gambit for cadential schemata. What we need to do, first of all, is really experience and feel all the strength of those bass leaps. And then we need to think about the intervals that we can put above them, rather than thinking C, G7, C, or 1, 5, 7, you know, thinking about the intervals that can go above. The root position, so we're only talking about intervals 3 and 5, and their compounds, and perhaps interval 7 for the 5 chord. So we can explore that, and we can explore it in 3 voices and 4 voices. 4 voices is a little more challenging to do correctly on the guitar because of fingering limitations. But we can do this in 3 harmonic positions. And a harmonic position is defined by what's in the upper voice. So harmonic position 1 has the tonic in the upper voice. Position 2 has the third. And you guessed it, position 3 has the fifth. So we can explore this kind of thing in a range of guitar keys, and it starts providing us with quite a bit of material. And the idea is to do it in an exploratory fashion, thinking about the voices. We can go a bit further by thinking about the voice leading of the half steps, 3, 4, and 7, 8, to make sure that they connect properly. And we can also think about the upper voice, trying to move it by step. But the main thing is thinking about the bass and the intervals above. We can then move on to deceptive cadences and other weak cadences. Here's a standard schemata. A cadence like this requires some continuation, which gives us longer patterns. We can just follow the weak cadence with a strong one. Here's another weak cadence where we don't resolve onto a 5-3. Again, we need continuation with a strong cadence. And we can move on to the archetypical galant cadential progression, which consists of a stepwise bass ascent to the 5th scale degree, and the 5th scale degree is harmonized with a 6-4. We've heard it a million times. And we can also look at some common stylistic variations on the standard galant cadence. You might think I'm harping on a bit about cadences, but this is the bulk of preluding. So the flat 5 over the 3rd scale degree is very common, which is very common in Viennese music. Or this cadence with the raised 4th scale degree, known as the Pleyel cadence. It's a cadence that Sohr used very often. Sounds like this. In Sohr, so we're very close now actually to being able to improvise a complete short prelude. We have some historical examples of short prelude progressions, 6 or 8 chords. Usually these are notated without meter. Diabelli published a set of them. We can find some in Giuliani's Opus 100, and of course in many method books of the period, Doisy, Carulli, Molino, Carcassi, and so forth, if we want to look at some stylistic models. What we need, just to finish this off so we can actually play a prelude, is a formal schema. We need some opening formulas, and we need some closing formulas. So let's look at those next. So some opening formulas. Well, here's a simple one. A tonic pedal above which we can add a variety of harmony, making sure that we're resolving the half steps correctly. Or we could use any kind of stepwise bass movement and harmonize it according to the rule of the octave, ascending and descending. I know we haven't talked about the descending, but this would be something like this. For the closing schemata, again, a very simple tonic pedal, which we've heard a million times. Or we could do a bunch of low style 5/1s. Or a stylistic cordetta. Probably the most ubiquitous one is the 1-6-4-5-1. If we want to move on to more fully developed preludes, I'm not going to talk a lot about this because we don't have time, but we have some historical models in the repertoire. Preluding, Belli, Giuliani, Molino, etc. published some of these things. We need an overall broad formal scheme, and we just need the scheme that's used for all tonal music: exposition, development, and recapitulation. Now, of course, there's no thematic implications in this. It's purely by key. So we need this development modulating, some ideas for that. And this is the most interesting and fun part of improvising preludes. There's so many interesting ways to modulate and so many interesting places you can get to, you can move through, and all of this. It's too involved for today, but I just do want to give you just some couple of simple examples of modulation to a closely related key. All we need is a cadential passage in the new key. All the chords are almost the same in both keys, so it's quite easy to do. So in C, now we're in 5, and we could continue on. We could have had a weak cadence there, and then continued on with a strong cadence. Lots of gambits we could employ, and the same thing in the relative minor. So to start wrapping up here, I've suggested a pedagogical sequence. Just to give an overview of it, we talked about taking very short, simple bass progressions and exploring the intervals that can go above those bass progressions, and taking into consideration the movement of half steps. The second step would be to fully explore the rule of the octave and understand it and be able to improvise with it in a variety of keys and a variety of harmonic positions. Then looking at cadential progressions of various types, which can be combined together to produce continuation and longer patterns. Looking at opening and closing formulas, so that we can frame these cadential progressions and create an actual self-contained short prelude. If we want to go on to longer preludes, then we need some modulating schemata. And if you wish to look into that, then that will be the next step. Above all, we need to be thinking about the bass and the intervals above it, rather than chord symbols, chord shapes, Roman numerals, and we have to work in an exploratory, curious, improvisatory fashion. So to conclude, I hope you will agree with us that improvisation can be a useful part of our learning and teaching of written out, composed music. The process is one of some practical theoretical guidelines, and this will be followed by practical exploration on the instrument and leading to improvisation on these ideas. And this is pretty much the training system of the common practice period. It combines theory with practice, and it adds the musical side benefits that regular improvisers seem to enjoy. So with this, I'd like to say thank you, There's just one remaining slide that would have to be paused so you could read it at some resources. If you can't do that, just remember this: classicalguitarstudy.com. That's one of my websites. It's where I put all my publishing stuff, articles, lecture handouts, and so forth. And I will put my lecture notes up there for this lecture, and my musical examples, which are far more than what I showed today. And with that, presumably, on to Steve.